Everybody can hear me. Hi, everybody. I'm Jesse Watson. Thanks for the introduction. Nikki, push the screen back. So you can see my face. So I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Chris MacColl. Just a quick, brief background about how I know Chris and how maybe he got to be here. I think it was 2019. Does that sound right, Chris? Chris reached out. He was working in Northern Australia, doing some work with the Red Goshawk, and was interested in starting up a PhD studying the species. And he hadn't had the opportunity to capture and band them yet, hadn't had a lot of hands-on experience with them. So he found Hawkwatch International as an organization that does that kind of work. And so he just sent a cold call email, if you will, to me and to the organization, and asked if he could come join and kind of volunteer at one of our migration sites just to get hands-on experience to help him be better suited to do this work. And a lot of people reach out to us with that kind of interest, but we can't allow all the people that have interest to come and do that. Everybody wants to learn how to catch and band and tag raptors. But obviously we have an interest in sharing that knowledge with folks that are going to be doing good research in other countries and in places where that research needs to be done. So we said, yeah, let's do it, and tried to figure out a way to get Chris here, and then COVID happened. So that was 2020 and beyond. Of course, COVID's still a thing, but that shut down any possibility of him coming here and joining. So we just kind of stayed in touch, and luckily Chris found some more regional folks that had experience that were able to help him out. And he started his PhD and has been doing great work for several years. We stayed in touch, and he invited me out and said, hey, after COVID kind of died down a little bit, hey, do you want to still come out and help me with my last PhD field season? And I didn't really need that much convincing. So last November, I joined Chris for about 5 weeks in Australia and got to see a lot of this stuff firsthand, which was a lifetime experience, obviously. So we got to capture and band and track juvenile red goshawks, which you're going to hear about this evening. So certainly my pleasure to actually have Chris here in person and share him with you all, because I've only been able to share pictures and stories until tonight. So with that, I'll read a formal bio with some background on Chris, and then we'll introduce him and we'll start the talk. So bear with me as I try to read through this. Chris is a PhD candidate from the University of Queensland in the Research and Recovery of Endangered Species, rarest, lab. He became aware of raptors at a young age whilst watching the local peregrine falcons pick off his father's homing pigeons. After completing his undergraduate studies, his work took him north to the vast tropical savannas of Cape York Peninsula at the very top of Australia. Here, he encountered Australia's rarest and most enigmatic raptor, the Red Goshawk, Erythrotriarchus radiatus, and has been captivated ever since. Working along colleagues, what began as a pilot study in 2015 has grown into Chris's current PhD research investigating the many knowledge gaps surrounding this poorly known species. After 4 years spent in the field surveying, monitoring, and tagging birds, Chris has now commenced writing up his doctoral thesis. The Red Goshawk has ignited Chris's passion for birds of prey, and he hopes to continue working with this incredibly important group of predatory birds in the future. So, with that, I think that's enough hearing from me, and now we'll hear from the real expert on Australian raptors, Chris MacColl.
Hi folks, here in the room and online. Thank you, Jesse, for that very kind introduction, and just want to thank Hawkwatch International for the opportunity to be here. This is an organisation that I've certainly admired from afar for the work they do with raptors, both in their conservation science projects, their long-term monitoring with the migration network, training the next crop of raptor researchers, of which I had inspired to be until we had a global pandemic. And without further ado, we'll get into the presentation. There we go. Apologies for the delay. So this talk is entitled Studying the Endangered Red Goshawk and Australia's Other Poorly Understood Raptors. It's going to be broken up into two parts, as the title suggested, and part one is looking at our raptors more generally. So that's some background on Australia. It's big. In fact, it's the same size as the contiguous US. Both are 7.65 million square kilometres, so remarkably similar in fact. But our human population is just 26 million people, and it's highly concentrated around the coastal areas, particularly in the southeast and the southwest of the country. One of the factors as to why that is because it's very dry. 70% of the continent is classified as arid or semi-arid. Those sort of beige, cream coloured in the centre of the country. That's what we generally refer to as the outback. And it's the outback because we all live along the coast, and so it's out the back. It's subject to high rainfall variability, even in some of these coastal areas which are more productive. And to give you an example, this is where I live. It's a small city called Toowoomba, and what you're seeing there is our annual rainfall. The red dashed line is the average. It's around 780 millimetres or 33 inches, I believe. And yet, for example, last year we doubled our annual rainfall, and in 2019, which you might recall was full of droughts and fires, we had half our annual rainfall. So it's highly variable. It's warm. And I've done a conversion here for you American folks. There's the Fahrenheit conversion, but the average minimum temperature range is generally in the 50s to 80s. So there's no really cold winters for us. And it's isolated. As a result, it's very biogeographically distinct. You may recall from your geography class that Wallace's line. To the west of that line is connected to the Asian mainland, or it once was. So in terms of mammals, think about elephants, tigers, Asian rhinoceros. And then on the east of that line, that's where we have animals with pouches like koalas and possums. In terms of the bird fauna, we sort of have a transition zone between those two lines. But then east of Ledeca's line, that's really the distinct Australia-Papuan bird fauna, which encompasses the island of New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. So this poses the question, how might these factors shape our raptor species? Well, firstly, there is no mass migration. Migration remains highly variable both within species and across species. So birds can be resident, they can be partially migratory, they can be nomadic, and that can be both within species or across species. We have no arrivals from other continents, so even the birds that might be escaping those harsh winters in the northern hemisphere, they do not reach Australia. And that's despite the use of the East Asian flyway by other species. And to give you a couple of examples of birds that get kind of close, or raptors, we have the Japanese sparrowhawk. And the two routes that birds typically take in this flyway is more of an island hopping route to the east, where they cross the Korean Peninsula or Japan through Taiwan down into the Philippines and beyond, or they stick more to the Asian mainland through Thailand, Malaysia, and then into Indonesia. So keep an eye on those two routes, and I'll give you another couple of examples. This is the Chinese sparrowhawk, a similar species that found more on the Asian mainland, doesn't quite reach Australia. Then we have the grey-faced buzzard. That is in fact the closest to a boodio or boodio-like bird, what you guys commonly call hawks, to actually reaching Australia. And perhaps most interestingly, we have the oriental honey buzzard. Now these guys actually do show up in Australia a couple times each year. They're still probably considered a vagrant, but we might be seeing an actual colonisation of Australia in the future. Because of this isolation, we have high levels of endemic species. For example, 39% of our raptors are endemic, and that chart there breaks it up by the diurnal raptors and the nocturnal raptors, or the owls. But overall, 83% of our raptors are Australasian endemic, so east of that Wallace's line, incorporating parts of the islands of Indonesia, New Guinea, Australia, and so forth. And interestingly enough, we have some really unique and priority species for raptor research, such as the Flores hawk eagle and the Papuan harpy eagle. And I might mention that the Flores hawk eagle is actually a project, there's a project being undertaken through Hawkwatch International by local biologists. Again, because of this isolation, which has occurred over long timescales, our birds are phylogenetically unique. And so Australia has been identified as a global priority for conserving the evolutionary history of birds. Now on to the raptors. So our species are relatively understudied and poorly understood, particularly compared to other similarly developed countries. This is an example from a study commissioned by Hawkwatch International comparing American raptors and Australian raptors. Now I've removed species with a global distribution because we'd be duplicating counts there, such as the peregrine falcon, the barn-owlie osprey, which both our countries have. On the x-axis we have all of our raptor species, and on the y-axis we have the number of scientific publications. In the blue is the American species, and in the red are the Australian species. And so you can see a clear trend that our species are much less studied. Why might this be the case? Well, we have fewer long-term studies and lower sample sizes. So if you're thinking about the migration network that Hawkwatch runs and the trapping stations, that's not possible for us because we don't have migration. So that really reduces our ability to collect data. And this doesn't line up with funding timeframes very well, particularly traditional funding through universities, with typical PhD studies only funded for 4 years. So if you're dealing with a raptor, you need to go out, collect your data, analyse your data, write up your findings, and have it all complete within 4 years, and that's generally not possible. It's a big country with less people and institutions, so there's very much it's a matter of capacity. And we have generally less raptor skills because of all those reasons mentioned above. And finally, we have probably a little more difficulty obtaining scientific permits just in the way the legislation is written. Obviously, we need to use live lure animals in a lot of cases, particularly to trap raptors and do hands-on applied research, and this can be an impediment to doing research in Australia. But what work is being done or could be done? Well, the obvious first species for prioritisation would be the threatened species, and these are our 3 nationally threatened or near threatened species: the red goshawk, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, and then the grey falcon and the lead-winged kite. They are both endemic arid zone specialist species, and they are certainly candidates for future research effort. Then we've got state-listed species, which I seem to have seen a trend, which a lot of those tend to be arid and semi-arid zone raptors. So for instance, we've got the spotted harrier here. It's vulnerable in the state of New South Wales and has been subject to just 2 publications. Next, we have the square-tailed kite, another endemic species. It's endangered in South Australia and vulnerable in New South Wales and Victoria, and has only had 13 publications. And finally, we've got our largest falcon, an endemic falcon known as the black falcon. It is also vulnerable in New South Wales, critically endangered in Victoria, and rare in South Australia, but has only had 13 publications. We should really start to get a handle on long-term population trends, such as Hawkwatch International undertakes through its migration network. However, we need to apply probably a road survey methodology, and this is actually a project I work on with my local birdwatching group. It's a 25-year study and is ongoing, where we do a survey to the north, south, east and west of the town of Toowoomba. We finally analysed some of those findings, and quite interestingly, even though we're in a relatively productive rainfall belt, we find that the species diversity and species abundance all responds to rainfall. It doesn't matter, we looked at foraging guild, we looked at migration, it was a universal response to rainfall, so it's just further confirms that we are one big arid continent. Trapping and banding. This obviously provides us with the opportunity to get birds in the hand and conduct, I'm missing a photo there, and conduct other research, whether it be contaminant screening, tagging, identification of plumage and age classes. These are all areas of investigation. And then finally, tagging. Only 4 Australian raptor species have been tagged with GPS satellite telemetry, but each time it happens, we find that these birds are capable of long-distance movements. This is a swamp harrier named Henry, who migrates between Canberra and Rockhampton each year. Next is my friend Simon, who tags wedge-tailed eagles in Western Australia, and they are moving, as you can see over there, all over the continent, particularly dispersing juveniles. This is a little eagle. It migrates seasonally between Canberra and the Gulf of Carpentaria each year between breeding and non-breeding home ranges. So there's certainly further work we can do in that space. And finally, just to cap it off, I thought I might go through some of the Australian raptors so you can see the different species and groups of species that we have. We have 24 diurnal and 11 nocturnal species. I've coloured red the endemics. And so we've got 6 falcons, starting with the Nanking kestrel in the top left and going clockwise, followed by the brown falcon, the grey falcon, the black falcon. As you can tell, we're really original with our names. The peregrine falcon and the Australian hobby, which is kind of like a merlin. Next, we've got the true hawks, starting on the left and going clockwise. The collared sparrowhawk, which is just like your sharp-shinned hawk. And then the brown goshawk, again, is like your Cooper's hawk, ecologically. The red goshawk and the grey goshawk. But that's actually a white morph of the species and the only completely white raptor in the world. We have 2 harriers, the spotted harrier on the left, and that's an adult male swamp harrier on the right. 3 pernine kites and their relatives. These are Australian endemics. On the left, we have the black-breasted buzzard. In the middle, the square-tailed kite, and on the right, the Pacific barza. We have 2 white kites, or Alanus kites, both endemics. Down the bottom, we have the black-shouldered kite, and above, we have the letter-winged kite. We have 2 true eagles, or booted eagles. The little eagle on the left, it was the world's smallest eagle, but then it was split from the species in New Guinea, which is called the pygmy eagle. So I guess it's the 2nd smallest eagle. It's about a red-tailed hawk in size. And then our big eagle, the wedge-tailed eagle. We have 4 sea eagles and their relatives, starting with the almost as big as a wedge-tailed eagle, the white-bellied sea eagle on the left, a Brahminy kite, a whistling kite, and then a black kite down the bottom. All these occur throughout Asia. We have an osprey, just like you guys. 5 mast owls from the family Tyto, beginning in the top left with the Australian mast owl, the sooty owl, the eastern grass owl, and the barn owl. And finally, 6 hawk owls, beginning with the powerful owl, our largest owl on the left, which is actually likes to feed on juvenile koalas. They'll pull them off the backs of their mothers. It's pretty brutal. The boobook at the top there. And there's actually 3 species of boobooks, all island endemics. The rufous owl on the right and the barking owl on the bottom, which Jesse can verify barks like a dog. Now time for part 2, which is the subject of my PhD research, and we'll delve a little deeper into the red goshawk specifically. So some background about the red goshawk. It's considered Australia's rarest raptor. It was first catalogued near Sydney around 1790 with that painting there, which was actually derived from a bird that was nailed to an early settler's hut. And since then we've seen that it's an endemic species to the tropics and subtropics of eastern and northern Australia. It's in the genus Erythrotriorchis, and it shares that genus just with one other species, that one there, the chestnut-shouldered goshawk, a very rare species from New Guinea. And it's extremely dimorphic, meaning the females are much larger than the males. On average, males are about 588 grams, whereas the females are 1,100 grams. And yeah, the average male is pretty much half the size of the average female. It's a bird eater, which we'll get into a little bit later with the diet study, but there is a female holding a laughing kookaburra. It only has 1 to 2 young, so a low rate of reproduction, slow life history traits. So study number 1 of the PhD was basically trying to determine their population status and range. So for some background, we have these anecdotal reports of the species declining at regional scales, but there'd been no quantitative assessment to really verify that or quantify the rate of decline. So we compiled all those records there, but we found that the records were really biased to just a few nest sites that people knew about in Northern Australia and would continually go and visit and record locations at those same spots. So once we filtered out all of that and the duplicate records, we had very limited data to work with, about 700 records. However, the analysis revealed, and that's my cue to let you know that we're going to click on the next slide. Will show an animation. It'll be Australia and a continental scale. It'll show the records through time, coloured by state, and we'll talk about the patterns that we've been seeing between 1978 and 2020. So I'll draw your attention to Eastern Australia particularly, and you'll notice that the red dots in the state of New South Wales, that's down near the species, the southerly limit of the species' historical range. So through the 80s, the species was still occurring right across its range. And then we get into the state of Queensland and southern Queensland. That was once a relative hotspot for this species. But as we get up into the 2000s, those records start to blink out a little bit. We also see declines through central Queensland. And then for the last several years, all of the records have only come from the very north of Australia. So to quantify this, we looked at the latitude of records over time. We fitted a model to that, and as you can see, there's a clear trend of records coming from high latitudes over time. And so we've seen a significant northward range contraction for this species, really in the last 2 decades. Next, we wanted to conduct a regional scale analysis, so we used this eco-region framework and applied a modelling approach to try and come up with some population trends for each region and then assess what we think the species status is in that region. Basically, we come up with this map using a traffic light system and incorporating the species breeding range. The red areas are where it's gone extinct. The amber areas are where we're not quite sure what's going on. They are declining, but we think maybe birds might still persist there, we're unsure. And the green areas are where they still seem to be doing okay. And it's the only place where we can find breeding pairs. Now, the red area equates to a 34% loss of their breeding range. The uncertain declining area, that's about another 30%. And so they're really only persisting across 1/3 of their historical range across the very top of Australia. Because of these results, we were able to get the species upgraded to endangered. And we now have a national survey and nest monitoring program in development, and we're training local Indigenous rangers to conduct nest monitoring and surveys on their own traditional lands. This is a workshop I ran earlier with the Olcala Rangers, and if you notice in the background there, that's a nest we managed to find on their land. Study number 2, looking at the species diet. This has flow-on effects to a lot of the later studies. So we collected prey remains and we conducted direct observation of predation events at nests and food prey deliveries. This encompasses all of the northern Australian tropical savanna. You can see the sample locations there. We wanted to compare differences in diet between states and habitat. They have 2 distinct breeding habitats. They'll nest along creeks in these tall remnant stands of paper bark, we call it. And they'll also nest in these dry woodlands. We wanted to assess whether prey was being partitioned between the sexes. So were males hunting prey of smaller body size and females larger? So there's a partitioning. We want to assess whether prey selection is like specialised or they're just taking what's available to them. And use that information to look back at those red areas where they've gone extinct and see maybe those prey species are now missing, and so it's a prey-related issue as to why they've gone extinct. So these are our results. We found that they feed exclusively on other birds, 28 species in total, and mostly parrots and kookaburras. As you can see on the left, numerically and proportionally, the blue-winged kookaburra, that species you see there in the top left, is the most important prey species, but then numerically they are feeding on lorikeets. However, when you look at the blue plot, the sulphur-crested cockatoo becomes more important because of its large body size. So although they're taking that type of bird far less often than the smaller lorikeets, once you account for its body mass, it becomes a really important prey source. We found little difference between the various states, at least statistically speaking. Parrots and kookaburras, but then we did notice this guy creep in there into the Northern Territory, the straw-necked ibis. So then we looked at breeding habitat, and it seems that habitat is really influential as to what they eat. The woodland species really are woodland specialist birds, those kookaburras and parrots. But then when we look at the riparian species, riparian nests, we see a number of waterbird species and shrubland species come into the mix. And that's because where they nest on these creeks, generally the surrounding environment is much more open savanna. And so they're nesting in the areas where there's the only trees available to them. So that's the birds you're looking at there, everything from cattle egret to little corella, the pheasant cuckoo, and the straw-necked ibis. We find that females do in fact hunt larger prey, based on this evidence anyway. Looking on the x-axis, this is the breeding month, and on the y-axis is the prey body mass. Now you'll notice the size of the prey really drops around months 7, 8, 9, and that is when the female is incubating, so she's not hunting. So that's where we get kind of the signal as to when it's just the male hunting, and so we see the prey come down. We also found that prey selection seems to be specialised, so when we looked at the abundance of all of the birds in their environment, they really were selecting specific prey, those parrots and kookaburras. And the species decline doesn't appear to be linked to that prey because those parrots, the lorikeets, the cockatoos and the kookaburras, they're all doing fine in those areas where the species is now extinct. Study number 3 was looking at their nest productivity and requirements. So we conducted 5 years of nest surveys and monitoring, 2019 through to the present. We encompassed those 4 regions you see there across northern Australia, Cape York Peninsula, the top end, the Kimberley, and then off the coast we have the Tiwi Islands. And through collaborating with various partners, our data availability is improving. We have these historical baselines from the first and only prior study of the species in the 1980s that we can compare our data back to. We've got this new data that I've collected, and then we've got this longer term continuous data that the Indigenous folks on the Tiwi Islands have collected since the early 2000s. So we're all pulling this together through the recovery team to try and come up with some findings. Apparent nest productivity, just looking at the raw results, they seem to be doing okay in terms of breeding across that very northernmost Australia, where we think the species is now limited, at least as a breeding population. However, we obviously need to investigate further as to the environmental variables that accompany those breeding rates. But one interesting insight that we've noticed is that these really low years on the Tiwi Islands were all associated with tropical cyclones. And that's not a matter of cyclones hitting active nests because they breed outside of the cyclone season, but perhaps those cyclones like denude the foliage and reduce their hunting success because the prey can see them coming, or it just really hammers like the prey populations for a couple of years. We're not sure. Study number 4 was our home range habitat use and movement pattern study, so tracking adults essentially. And so we used these GPS satellite tags. A 17-gram tag goes on the much larger female, and a 9.5-gram tag goes on the much smaller male. We attach it with a harness. First we used Teflon, now we use Spectra. It's a lighter and stronger material. And we've tagged 23 birds since 2015, comprising 9 adults, 14 juveniles, 6 males and 17 females. So somewhat of a sex bias to 2 females. It took us a while to figure out how to catch males. We've got greater than 50,000 GPS and satellite locations, and that is growing because birds are still being tracked, some of them up to 4 years at the moment. And so some preliminary insights as to what we've learnt. Well, looking at their home range, we can say that red goshawks have a very large home range, in fact between 250 and 320 square kilometres, and I'll put that in some context in a moment. We replicated this study here, which was by a fellow named Peary in 2000. He was trying to figure out what determined the home range size of a raptor, and I've then thrown in our red goshawk data to get some context. So he found that it was related to two things. First was body mass, which kind of makes sense. That's the red goshawk there, along with the peregrine falcon and the gyrfalcon. Those two species to the right are the two large eagles here in North America. But most interestingly, I think, is the proportion of avian prey in their diet really was a determinant of home range size. So from that diet study, we know that red goshawks eat nothing but birds. And as you can see there, they have one of the largest home ranges of any raptor. Again, up there with the peregrine falcon and the gyrfalcon. In terms of habitat use, it appears that the species is woodland dependent, at least those pairs that are breeding in those woodlands, because remember we have those pairs in the riparian areas, in the more open savanna. We haven't tracked as many of those birds, so that's certainly an area of further investigation. But the ones that are in the woodlands pretty much just use the woodlands. As you can see there, that's the dark green area encompassing the home range, the 95% confidence interval of their home range, and it's dominated by that woodland habitat. In terms of their movement patterns, well, they're partially migratory. Around 22% of adults migrate. This is an example of one of those adults here on Cape York. That's her breeding range where she nests in the very north of the country, and she migrates about 900 kilometres south into more open savannas to have an established non-breeding season home range. But most of them are year-round residents on their breeding territories, including all of the males. And the final study was another tracking study, and we wanted to really just take a look at juveniles in particular, try and figure out where they disperse to and how many survive. So during 2021 and 2022, we just tagged juveniles. We managed to get 4 each year, so 8 in total, with a 3 male, 5 female split, so almost an even sex ratio. All on Cape York Peninsula. And as I said, determined first and second year survival thanks to these solar powered tags. They will last 2 years, if not longer, even the smaller ones. Obviously trying to look at all the different types of variables that might explain what birds survive and what birds don't. So we took a bunch of morphological measurements. And this is a short clip I'll play for you of what we saw half the birds do. Half the birds undertook this same migratory movement or dispersive movement across years. Apologies if the animation is a little clunky for those online and here. Should catch up in a moment. So as you can see here, this bird dispersed southward into the arid and semi-arid zone where it spent, well, what is effectively the summer. Our birds actually migrate to over summer, if that's a word, to escape the wet season, because it's very tropical here. So the wet season to them is monsoonal rain, so they seem to move inland into these more open, drier ecosystems, hang out there until the monsoon's over, return to the breeding range, and then interestingly enough, in their second year, they don't take that movement again. So these are the birds of 2021. So we had 2 individuals move down into those ecoregions you can see there, including a number of deserts and grasslands. 2022, we had 2 birds again, 2 of the 4 make their way down to that same area. And so this is like a really arid and semi-arid landscape. It's largely treeless besides the watercourses, and so totally different from the breeding range. We now know that this particular area in southwestern Queensland is an important conservation zone for first-year red goshawks, just first years. And not only that, it's an important area for other threatened raptors too, because you might recall the grey falcon and leather-winged kite are other 2 nationally threatened raptors. That's their eBird abundance maps on the left, and that's the area that the red goshawks are dispersing to. Obviously, the grey falcon is a little more widely distributed, but certainly a stronghold for them. And then the leather-winged kite, in particular, the one down the bottom, that area in southwest Queensland, they call that the Channel Country. That is the very stronghold of the species. So all 3 of our most rare and threatened raptors spend some time in this arid and semi-arid landscape, which is really cool. And that's all I've got to say. I'd just like to thank, there's too many people to thank, but there they are listed. The project partners that have been working on this project for the past 7 or 8 years. I definitely want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we work on, which we are so fortunate to get to go out and do this work. And there's my contact details if anyone would like to reach out. So thank you very much.
Cool. I think we can share the screen. Thanks, Chris. That was awesome. Do we have any questions? We have a little bit of time for questions here. Any from our local audience first? Meg, question.
I'd love to know, do you have any information on the diet of those birds that are going into the arid areas, or is it only breeding diet?
You want to repeat that just so folks online can hear?
Yeah. For the folks online, Meg has asked, do we have any information on the non-breeding diet of those birds that are flying into the arid zone? And the answer is we have no idea, absolutely no idea. The birds that they are eating during the breeding season do not occur in the arid zone whatsoever. So it would be an entirely different assemblage of birds. There are still a lot of parrots out there. Some you might be familiar with through like the pet trade, so cockatiels, budgerigars are very common. In terms of larger cockatoos, maybe corellas and galahs go out that far. But then, yeah, besides that, I really don't know. There's some large arid pigeons, but it would be totally fascinating to understand what they're doing out there.
Good question. Any other questions from our local folks? Jess?
Yeah, I was wondering if before you had the tracking data that showed that they went into those arid regions in their first year, if there were any occurrence of them out there before that, or if that was something that was totally a surprise.
Yeah, so the question was, prior to tracking those birds dispersing into the arid zone, did we have any idea that the species even occurred out there? And the answer is largely not. Vary by region. I'd say in total there might be 4 records for that part of the world, the arid zone in there. So yeah, absolutely no idea. And to see such a high proportion of the birds, like it wasn't just a one-off or one of 8 birds flying in there, it was half the birds we tagged, albeit smaller sample sizes, but across years as well. So it wasn't just like an environmental factor, because it might have been a productive year in the arid zone that year. So yeah, really, really exciting.
A question that came in online, since we're talking about the first year birds, why do first year birds summer in a different place? Is that a conservation area in the arid zone just based on the limited transmitter data you have?
So what's the second part?
Is that a conservation area in the arid zone just based on the limited transmitter data you have? So I'm not sure where they're going with that second part, but I think maybe answer the first part if you know anything about adults moving in that area.
No, we haven't tracked adults into that area. We do have two adult migrants, both females. One of them, I showed you the map of their movement. So it is a species that moves from the breeding range into a more semi-arid part of their range, but it still could potentially be breeding range. We're not sure. And then the other one in the Northern Territory, she moves into the Tanami Desert, so a very arid zone and not part of the breeding range. In terms of it being a conservation area, yeah, that's just my claim, based on all of the high proportion of red goshawks moving into that area, and then knowing that is the stronghold for the Leadwing kite in particular, but it's also where a lot of bird watchers go to see grey falcon, our 3 rarest and most threatened raptors.
So if it's not a conservation area, it maybe should be.
Yeah, that's just me claiming it's a conservation area. It's actually just used for cattle farming at the moment, so we need to do something about that. Yeah.
Any other questions from our local audience? Yeah.
Chris, so do you, or it sounds like there's I forget what it was, like a working group of folks focusing on the species. So if it's not, differences in prey that led to the birds basically going extinct in more southern areas, do you have suspicions about what it could be? Like maybe your top, next lines of things that you want to investigate if there's other changes that are happening?
Yeah, essentially, the question is, what are my thoughts on why the species has gone extinct, since it doesn't seem to be a result of a lack of prey from the diet information we now have. So yeah, I suspect habitat loss is a big one. So like, you might recall that human population map I showed. That's where most of the people live in our cities and our our farms. There's been a lot of deforestation in Eastern Australia. But one hypothesis we have is the remaining habitat, because there is still quite a bit of bush around there. It may have thickened right up because as fire is suppressed, because we all live around there. So the response to a wildfire is to try and put it out. Whereas in the very north of Australia, where they persist, fire is very much a natural part of the landscape. Like these areas burn every single year. It's just a total normal thing to see fire every year. It just all grows up during the wet season, which all of the rainfall comes in about 4 months. Everything really grows, big tall grass as tall as me, and then it totally dries off because the rain just stops, and then it burns, and that maintains a sort of openness to the habitat, like the woodland habitat that they use, because it's the biggest of our accipiters or accipiter-like birds, so it's got the biggest wingspan. It hunts below and through the canopy, chasing those lorikeets, knocking off those kookaburras from their perches. And so I think the habitat might have gotten too thick for them. So the prey might be there, but their hunting success might have declined, and so they just can't get at it. Yeah.
Do you have any habitat structure data from those historic nests that are no longer occupied, where you could perhaps look at maybe if the forest subcanopy is too thick compared to what you're seeing? Just curious.
Yeah, no, exactly. We're on the same line of thought. We don't have data to look at, but we have the data set now. We've compiled the data set of all the records. And so, one thing we might now do is go back to the places where they've gone extinct, the dots on the map, and then maybe look at remote sensing like NDVI through time, because I think the satellite imagery for that goes back to the 80s. And so if we see a greater reflectance of NDVI, that means there's greater canopy. You could infer that it's thicker. And also look at what's happened, to say a radius around each of those dots. Has the habitat really been cleared? And try and make some of those inferences. That would probably be the next PhD student's job, I would say.
All right, a couple more good questions that have come in. So a few more minutes and then we'll wrap up. Our good friend Frank, who was on one of our migration crews, or several migration crews in past years, have you seen longevity with track birds, or is there a high rate of mortality?
No, the adults survive pretty darn well, particularly the females. So we are getting longevity data. For instance, we have one female who we tagged in 2018. She was already a breeder, so we assume 3 years old. So what's that, another 5? So she's 8 years old at least. She's still wearing her tag, even though it's no longer transmitting. We did in fact try to recapture her to remove the tag and put a band on her, but she was having none of it. So we actually think they're pretty darn smart and difficult to recapture. So we've got some marked birds just by the fact they're wearing their tags, but we'd like to maybe transition to a colour banding type scheme, and that national nest monitoring program we're hoping to get underway to just add more value to the data that we can collect. If I could band all those birds and those Indigenous rangers could monitor them, for example.
Okay, 2 more, and I think we'll finish up. Why was it harder to trap males, and how do, if they do, techniques differ when trapping males versus female goshawks?
It's essentially just the contact time. So we tag females. The strategy for us was to, we wait till the chicks have hatched and they're thermoregulating for themselves so that we can have mum off the chicks and they don't die from exposure. So they've got to be about at least 10 days old. Female's obviously been sitting on eggs and she's really hungry and food stressed, so that's when we catch the females and they just come right down pretty much at that time. So that works great. The males are just hardly ever there. They're hunting, they're providing, so we just wouldn't have that same contact time. And if we say went to a nest and wanted to go for the female, the female would just come down and we'd catch her. So we ended up shifting the timing of our trapping to pre-breeding. That was something we were sort of hesitant to do because we didn't want to mess up their breeding event. It's an endangered species. It comes with a lot of pressure when you're working with those birds. But eventually we did it. Caught the male because he was there. He was available to be caught. Again, with the same method, a bow net. He eventually came down. It took longer. They're much more wary and suspicious, I guess, because they're so much smaller. But we caught him pre-breeding. He went on to, they produced a fledgling. We got all of that breeding information from that male of foraging range. And so, it was a good result, but we only got that in the last year of the study. So definitely more work to be done with males, that's for sure.
Cool. All right, so last question, toughest one for last. Are there plans to continue your research once you're done with your PhD?
Oh, I certainly hope so. Yeah, so we have the species, being a nationally endangered species, has a recovery team. Like I think I said, it's now a priority species for funding. It's a species that's triggered by a lot of development. So if a developer, whatever type of developer, whether it be agriculture, gas, mining, wind farms, red goshawks are triggered a lot, particularly in northern Australia. So I feel like this will generate, more attention, funding opportunities, and obviously I'm the first person to do a PhD, so a lot of it's still really ecological information. But like the question revolving around determining why they declined, that's hopefully going to be more students and more research that's ongoing.
Great, good answers, good questions, good answers. All right, everybody, let's thank Chris. So we're going to wrap up here in a second. At the end, Sammy, maybe right now, will share a little link to a really high quality video that Chris got to be part of that kind of summarizes and talks about some of his research with some cool footage and whatnot. It doesn't stream very well, so that's why we're not going to stream it over online. But remote folks can watch that. Chris has generously shared that link, and we'll show it, just a brief portion of it here once we kind of close down the WebEx. And I think that's all I've got.
Yeah.
Anything else to add here?
No, just thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I'll let you do that.